Hello, everyone, and welcome to Orientalism History. Today, we're talking about the Fatimid Caliphate, an Ismaili Shia dynasty that ruled Egypt and North Africa from the 10th to the 12th centuries. My guest today is Dr. Shainool Jiwa, a distinguished historian and scholar specializing in the study of the Fatimid Caliphate. Dr. Jiwa is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, where she has researched and published on the history of this fascinating period. In today's episode, we dive into the history of the Fatimid Caliphate, a North African empire that left a lasting legacy on the Islamic world and beyond. Dr. Jiwa shares her insights into the origins and expansions of the Fatimids, their unique approach to governance, and how they established much of the most enduring Islamic institutions of Egypt. We also explore the inclusivity of the Fatimid administration, where Jewish and Christian officials served as prime ministers of a Muslim caliphate. Expect to learn about the Fatimid impact on North Africa and the Mediterranean, the significance behind the naming of Al-Azhar Mosque, and the diverse religious and cultural landscape that they nourished. That and much more in today's conversation. Hello, and thank you for joining me today, Professor Shainool. Today we'll be discussing the Fatimids and the Fatimid Caliphate. Let's get right into it. Maybe we can start off by talking about who are the Fatimids and how did they rise to power?
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me on the program. I look forward to our conversation this afternoon. So the Fatimids are an Ismaili Shia dynasty who claim their name from Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, and they they claim their status from the fact that they are direct descendants from the Prophet Muhammad through Hazrat Fatima and Imam Ali. And that is why they come to be called Fatimids in the first place, which is an interesting way of naming a dynasty on the name of a woman, which is unusual. So that kind of just from their name, that's who they are. When do they arrive on the political scene? Well, they proclaimed themselves as a caliphate in 909 in Ifriqiya, which is today in Tunisia, in present-day Tunisia. And when they proclaim themselves as caliphs, they are already claiming to be Shia Ismaili Imams, i.e. religious leaders of their community, but now they claim also to be the rulers over the entire Muslim world, as it were. They claim themselves to be Amir al-Mu'mineen, i.e. the caliphs over the Muslim world. And that happens in 909 CE. As I said, it happens in Ifriqiya. It's interesting that they emerge on the political scene quite suddenly in that sense, because what had happened is that, if I can sort of take us back a little to the founding of the Abbasid dynasty in 750 CE, once the Abbasids come to power on the Shia ticket, so to speak, as the descendants of the Prophet, the Shia Imams after that are heavily persecuted, particularly with the death of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, who was the grandson of Imam Hussein, who was martyred in Karbala. So once Imam Jafar al-Sadiq passes away in 765 CE, which is 15 years after the Abbasids have established themselves in power in Baghdad, the Shia leadership then are heavily persecuted. And one of the things that happens as regards the Ismaili Shia branch is that their imams go into what comes to be termed the Dor al-Satar, the period of concealment. And that period lasts from 765, from the death of Imam al-Sadiq, right up until 909, when Abdullah al-Mahdi declares himself as the first Imam Caliph. So it's about a century and a half of the time lag between that. During that time, Ahmed, what is very interesting is that there is a movement that starts, which is called the Da'wah, i.e. literally to call. So they call in the name of this movement, is a calling in the name of these Ismaili Imams who are in hiding but are known only to their most trusted followers, as it were. These dais, the people who are now summoning, if you like, for the Ismaili imams, have two claims. They are a religio-political movement. So they are claiming that the Ismaili imams are the true rulers, the righteous rulers over the Muslim world, and that they need to be established as a rule, as a political rule, so that they can righteously rule over the Muslim world instead of the Abbasids, who they consider have usurped their power and authority. So this Dawa movement, this Ismaili Dawa movement, spreads across many parts of the Muslim world. And one of the regions where it takes root and is successful is in Africa, as I said, present-day North Africa. And so it is on the success of the Ismaili Dawa movement that that Abdullah al-Mahdi, the first Fatimid Imam Caliph, actually travels all the way from Salamia in Syria right across the southern Mediterranean coast, and finally arrives into this region where he is publicly proclaimed. So that, in a nutshell, is who the Fatimids are, what their origins are, and how they make their proclamation of their caliphate in North Africa.
So they proclaim a caliphate in North Africa, in what's now Tunisia. What was the reaction from the Abbasid authorities and the Abbasid Caliphate?
Yeah. So remember, by this time, there was a lot of decentralization happening of the Abbasid Empire. There were several dynasties that were ruling on behalf of the Abbasids, so to speak, i.e., pronouncing their name in the khutbah, the Friday prayers, and sending a certain agreed amount of taxation. But beyond that, they were pretty much ruling independently. And there were Shia dynasties like that too. So, for example, we had the Idrisids ruling in present-day Morocco already by this time, who were, of course, Shia. So the Abbasids take this rise of the Fatimids, I suspect, as yet another dynasty that is claiming authority for itself. And it probably didn't take the Abbasids probably didn't take particular notice, I suspect, of the Fatimids because they were proclaiming themselves on the outskirts, if you like, in the Maghreb, in the west of the vast Muslim empire that the Abbasids ruled. So I suspect that initially there wasn't such a big concern necessarily that the Abbasids felt. When it becomes much more serious is when they arrive in Egypt, because now they are at the center stage of the Muslim world. They are sharing borders almost with the Abbasid lands. They are fighting over the same territories in Syria, for example, etc. So that's 60 years later when they move into Egypt, the Fatimids move into Egypt, that they really start to affect the Abbasids directly.
Great. So let's talk about that expansion into Egypt. So they start off in Tunisia, they build their base there for 60 years, and then they start expanding across Egypt. Can you talk a little bit about what the motivations were behind that expansion across North Africa and into Egypt? Why did they do it?
Yeah. So initially, of course, the Fatimids face a lot of challenges in terms of establishing their minority Shia rule in North Africa, which was ethnically as well as religiously very diverse, and the Shia were a minority. So it takes them a while to really establish themselves in North Africa. There are revolts that they face, etc. But among the particularities or among the distinctiveness, if you like, of the Fatimids is that they very quickly build a very powerful navy. And this navy allows them then to patrol, of course, their territories from attacks from the Byzantine rulers who were ruling at Constantinople, with their capital in Constantinople, as well as the Umayyads of Andalusia, who also, of course, were around at this time in the Mediterranean world of the time. And so, by building this powerful navy, the Fatimids ensure their own security, but they also become controllers in many ways of the southern Mediterranean terrain, which means that they can then levy duties on ships that are passing by across the Mediterranean, etc. All this means that they accumulate a lot of wealth and power. And so by the time you come into the time of the fourth Fatimid Imam Caliph al-Muizz Lidinallah, who takes over power in 953 CE, you find that the Fatimids now are really solidly established economically, militarily, politically, etc. And so in Al-Muizz's time, we know of him then sending this very well-known general called Jawhar as-Sikili. Interesting to note the surname Sikili, i.e. from Sicily, because today we think of North Africa as part of African continent and we think of Sicily as part of Europe. But geographically, they are very close. And in fact, the main city, the first Fatimid capital that the Fatimids built, which is in a place called Al-Mahdiya, which exists to this day in Tunisia, it's a ferry's journey to Sicily. So Sicily becomes very much part of the Fatimid rule very early on. And what the Fatimids also do is that they send this General Jawhar all the way to Morocco, to the Atlantic coast, i.e. all the way to the west, to ensure that they have that region under their authority. And once they've done that, once they've marched westwards, as it were, and established their rule, the same general is then assigned, Jawhar as-Sikili, to then march on to Egypt. And it's interesting the way they arrive in Egypt, Ahmed, because a lot of dawah and diplomacy has already taken place in Egypt. But you have a question.
Sorry, yeah. Can we talk? That's very interesting. So they went west first.
Yes.
Were they able to conquer Morocco and Algeria and so on?
Yes, so what they do is they conquer the littoral, the coastal areas. They ensure that the rulers who were ruling there are now under their suzerainty. So they
And
do
then did they
that
try?
first.
And then did they try to go across into Al-Andalus, where you said the Umayyad Caliphate was still
No,
existing?
so that's interesting. While we know of Fatimids functioning in Andalus, the Umayyads in Andalusia under Abdurrahman III at this time are pretty strong. And so the Fatimids aren't able to militarily cross over into Andalus, but there is a lot of proxy fighting going on, if you like, and animosity that takes place through these dynasties in Algeria and Morocco, right, between the Fatimids and the Umayyads, which is why the Fatimids ensure that they've now got their control and are not, that they are ensuring that they won't be attacked from the west, as it were, when they are moving eastwards.
Got
Right?
it. So they
They
secure
cover
their
their ground.
western front. They
Exactly.
they they secure Sicily. It sounds like is
Yes.
also under Fatimid
Yes.
control.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about
Yeah. So Egypt at this time is under the Ikhshidid dynasty, which is giving nominal allegiance to the Abbasids, but essentially, they are appointing their own rulers and governors and ruling in Egypt. And so there are several things that come together in Egypt at this time. One, there is an issue about succession in among the Shidid rulers themselves. So that causes a major internal rupture. The second is that we all know, of course, that Egypt is the land of the Nile and the gift of the Nile. So when the Nile doesn't rise adequately over several years, or over rises, if you like, floods over too much, in either case, Egypt then suffers from famine and pestilence and other major economic challenges. And in this period, Egypt had gone through that kind of a crisis, agrarian crisis, economic crisis, and a political crisis under the Ikhshidids. And so what happens is that there is a regent, Kafur, who takes over the rule on behalf of the Ikhshidids. And Kafur then ends up having a treaty, if you like, an agreement with Almoez, the Fatimid ruler, that as long as Kafur rules over Egypt, the Fatimids would not come into Egypt. But once Kafur dies, the Fatimids now have a clear path, if you like, right? So that's one way in which their diplomacy has already taken root. So, for example, we have some interesting material artifacts. We know that coins were minted in Almoez's name in Egypt 15 years before the actual Fatimid takeover. We know that banners were distributed in the name of Almoez, again, almost over a decade before. So the Dawa in Egypt had always been very strong, the Ismaili Dawa. So the Dawa plays this role of diplomacy. We know that all the major stakeholders, entrepreneurs, political agents, etc., had all had prior to the Fatimid arrival in terms of their guarantee of safety of their life and their properties, etc. So all this has already taken place, but you have this record in the sources of over 100,000 men, i.e., a very large army, leaving from Ifriqiya, marching all the way to Egypt, 1,500 miles. In those days, it's quite a terrain to cover. It takes them months. They arrive in Egypt. It takes the army, we are told, 7 days to cross over into Egypt through the bridge of Giza. But there are very few minor skirmishes. There is no bloodbath. There is no major uh, warfare because, as I said, all of this has been negotiated ahead of time. So by and large, it's a peaceful takeover that the Fatimids have in arriving into Egypt.
Great. And what did they do once they came to Egypt? I think I read that they established Cairo. Is that true? And what were their early kind of policies and successes in the region?
Yeah. So it's very interesting. The Fatimids arrive in Egypt, and before their arrival with Jauhar Asikili, the commander, Almuiz had issued through him an Amman document, a guarantee of safety for the people of Egypt, of the different stakeholders in Egypt. And so these negotiations of how the Fatimids were going to rule over Egypt is, in that sense, you almost have a template of their model of governance in this Amman document. And it's very interesting that we have the luxury of that Amman document surviving through two different historiographical records. So we have it through the writings of Al-Makrizi, who is a Mamluk historian, i.e. he writes in the 15th century under the Mamluks, but had access to Fatimid sources. And we have it through the writings of Imad ad-Din Idris, who was a Yemeni scholar, Dai, as well as a ruler, who also writes in the 15th century from Yemen and has access to these Fatimid sources. So these two are almost exact contemporaries, but we have no record of them ever meeting, these two historians. But they both preserve this whole document. So That's a fascinating, source, primary source that we have access to, which gives us this blueprint of Fatimid governance, which then Fatimids, once they arrive in Egypt, rule over Egypt for almost 200 years. So it's a long period of rule. We remember the Umayyads, the first dynasty of Islam, for example, before the Abbasids take over, and they rule for 90 years. Here we have the Fatimids ruling in Egypt for 200 years, just as a comparison, right? They are the only Shia dynasty who ever rule over Egypt. The Shia never rule over Egypt after that or before that. So they are quite distinct in that sense. And as you rightly said, Ahmad, they laid the foundations of Cairo, which was called Al-Qahira al-Muizziya, the victorious city of Al-Muez, which is then shortened to Al-Qahira today, of course, Cairo as we know it. And even today, if you go to Cairo, the main thoroughfare of the historic part of the city, even today, is named Sharia al-Muizz Allah, the street of al-Muizz Allah. So you still have these very interesting connectors there of their Fatimid past. But coming back to Cairo, so they laid the foundation of Cairo. They also laid the foundation of the Azhar, which of course today the Azhar University, the Azhar Mosque, is of course the bastion of Sunni scholarship and learning, etc. But it is founded by the Fatimids, and it's interesting that it's called the Azhar because it takes on the same epithet as Zahra. So Fatima is Zahra, the illuminated, and so they named the mosque as Al-Azhar Mosque. And so the foundation of the city of Cairo, which was initially a palace city, really, it was a palatial city. It was a city where the rulers and their immediate aides lived, just like Baghdad was when it was first established by the Abbasids, excuse me. But soon enough, of course, it becomes a major metropolis over time. And it's also very interesting that when we think of the Azhar, it of course functioned as the mosque of Azhar, but there were also 35 scholars, we are told, housed by the Azhar who would teach in between prayer times to people who wish to learn about the religious subjects of the day. So the role of Al-Azhar as a communal, congregational space, as well as a place of learning and scholarship, is something that you find inherent from that period of time.
So the Fatimids are known for their, Ismaili Shia orientation. All the things you just mentioned. Was there an Ismaili angle to the policies and the governance and the teachings of the caliphate at the time, or was it more kind of broad, non-Ismaili?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Ahmed, because the answer is yes, both. So the mosques that they built, the Azhar, and then after that the Anwar Mosque that is built in Al-Aziz's time, the fifth Fatimid Imam Caliph, the Akmar, which is built much later, you notice are all epithets of light. So they are obviously making reference, symbolic reference to this idea of Nurun ala Nur, right? This idea of light upon light that is mentioned of course, as part of the Quranic verse of Ayat an-Nur. But it's interesting that these spaces were then Shia mosques. So anyone who claimed, who prayed, with the Shia adhan, with the Shia form of prayer, etc., would gather together and could offer their salat in these places, as it were. So you find that there is a commonality in terms of prayer, spaces of prayer and congregation with other Shia. But it's very interesting, the Amman document that I mentioned to you earlier makes explicit reference to Muslims of other denominations, Sunni denominations, for example. And it stipulates that those who are Shafi, Maliki, Hanbali, Hanafi, other forms of Sunni Islam and others could continue to practice in their own spaces of worship and gathering, but their upkeep of these spaces was paid for by the state, by the Fatimid Imam Caliphs. So they allow for an inclusive way of practice of faith, such that each community could have their own space, and it was provided for in terms of, it goes into great detail, of the ways in which the provisions were made for these spaces. It's also interesting in terms of governance. So, for example, we know that the Fatimids institute the Wazirate, the model of the chief administrator, the Wazir, very much based on the Abbasid model. But unlike the Abbasids, who we know had a particular preference for appointing wazirs, the chief ministers, from within certain middle class families like the Barmakids, with whom they had close relations over the generations. The Fatimids do something different in that they open up the wazirate, the appointments into the administration, all the way to the chief minister, the wazir, to those who have the competencies for that role, but may not be Shia, may not be Ismaili, may be Muslims of other persuasions, may be Christian, because we know that Egypt had a very large indigenous Christian population, Copt Christian population, when the Fatimids first arrived in Egypt. We know that there were several Jewish communities who had been settled there for millennia. So we then find examples of a Jewish chief minister or of a Christian chief minister getting appointed, but reporting to the Fatimid Imam Caliph. What that does is that it allows the Fatimids to draw from a much larger pool of competencies of the country. And it allows for people who then serve in these positions to feel connected to the state, to feel that they are invested in the state, as it were. And so it allows, it's a win-win scenario, if you like, both ways. So you find that the Fatimids allow for also Ismaili spaces of worship. So, for example, we know of these spaces called Majalis al-Hikmah. Majalis, of course, Majlis. Hikmah, meaning the teachings of the Prophet and the teachings of the Imams as the Shia considered them to be valid. And so you had these special gatherings that would happen in some of the Shia mosques like the Azhar, but also in the Fatimid Palace, where those who had given allegiance to the Fatimids as their Shia Imam could gather and learn more about the teachings of their Imams, etc. And there were special gatherings for women, and there were gatherings for men, there were gatherings for those who were visiting the city and wanted to, partake of this learning. So you again have a lot of interesting material around this. And one interesting point that comes to mind, an interesting contrast actually between the Fatimids and the Abbasids, is that we all know that the Abbasids came to power through the use of the dawah, what was called the Abbasid dawah. You had Abu Muslim al-Khurasani lead that dawah. So we know that. Yet once the Abbasids come to power, we know that that whole aspect of Abbasid background is then very quickly dismantled. Abu Muslim al-Khurasani is put to the sword because it would otherwise set up an alternate source of power and authority. So you can see the rationale from a political point of view, of course. Under the Fatimids, as we were discussing earlier, it is the Dawah that brings the Dawla into being, the Fatimid state into being. But the Dawah is continued as the religious arm of the state. So if you wanted to be part of that aspect of the Fatimids, you had to be an Ismaili. So there was this exclusivity in terms of serving in the Fatimid Dawa. But in the governance of the state, it was open to a much broader range of people. Similarly, the judiciary also. So we know that the Fatimids not only allowed for but facilitated the upkeep of the courts of justice. So if on matters of personal law, like inheritance, like commercial interactions, like divorce, etc., people could go to their own courts, i.e., a Maliki could go to a Maliki court for judgment. A Shafi could go to a Shafi court for judgment. Jews could go to their own courts. Christians could go to their own courts on matters of personal law. On matters of state law, public law, it was Fatimid law that prevailed. What that did, though, is that it allowed communities to live according to their madhab as they wished, both in terms of judiciary and judicial decisions, as well as the administrative administration of the country. They also had what we know what's called the Madhalim. So the Madhalim courts were the courts where one could go, and this is a Muslim institution. You see it in Umayyad times and in Abbasid times as well. Although by this time, under the Abbasids, it had kind of become delegated to lower officials of the state. The Fatimids reinvigorate the Madhalim institution, and so what that is that any member of the country, if they feel that they had been misjudged or misrepresented or were harmed in any way by the officials of the Fatimid state, they could seek redress for it through these Mazalim courts. And it was the chief minister who sat twice a week, and in some cases we have details of sitting on a Tuesday afternoon and a Thursday afternoon, etc., where anybody from any subject could come over and get access to the chief minister and put forward their complaint and seek justice. So they allow for this access, if you like, to justice through the Fatimid system as well, through the Madalim, but as well as allowing it for each of the communities through their own courts.
So quite a diverse society, very tolerant of non-Ismaili denominations. What impact did that have on kind of the intellectual and the cultural life of the caliphate? Can you discuss some of the contributions to arts, science, and education that happened at the time of the caliphate?
Yeah. So that's very interesting, Ahmed, because there is Cairo very soon becomes a metropolis of which attracts scholars, scientists, people with all kinds of cultural contributions, scientific contributions, and again in the ilk of the Dar al Hikmah that was established by Ma'mun, right? We know the Beit al-Hikmah, sorry. Remember the Beit al-Hikmah that Al-Ma'mun, the Abbasid al-Ma'mun establishes in the 9th century, where you have all this knowledge from the Greek tradition, from the Persian tradition, from the Indian tradition, now being brought into the Muslim world and translated into Arabic. This was in the 9th century, of course, that this happens. And so that becomes provides a major impetus for Muslims to learn about the previous civilizations, the neighboring, the scholarship that had been around the world of their time, and to contribute to that, right? Cairo similarly becomes like that in the 10th century under the Fatimids. They establish under Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, who is the 6th Fatimid Imam Caliph, this major center called the Dar al-Hikmah, which is very interesting in that, today, Ahmed, if we want to access knowledge whether it is good information or not so good, we can press a button, so to speak, and see some information on our screens, etc. We know that in those days, books were extremely expensive and rare because they were often written on parchment, etc. So they were very precious, even in terms of their monetary value. So what we find is that in this Beit al-Hikmah, Al-Hakim allows or enables copies of all the manuscripts that were there in the Fatimid library. And we are told the Fatimid library, like the Umayyad of Andalusian library, was one of the gems of the world at the time. It was recognized as one of the wonders of the world of that time. That all these books are now copied and brought into this Beit al-Hikmah. And scholars are invited to come and partake of this knowledge. We know that there was a waqf created, an endowment created for the provision of the upkeep of the Beit al-Hikmah. And in that waqf deed that still survives, you get detailed instructions around, this much amount of dinars is to be paid for the upkeep of the place, for the provision of writing materials, for the provision of curtains, for the provision of the upkeep and cleanliness of the place, etc., etc. So they really pay attention to all aspects of this place that anyone could come to and visit. So you have this very famous scholar at the time, Al-Musabihi, who is a Shafi scholar living in this period. And he says, this is unheard of. This is a rare event that has happened, in our time, that anyone from any walk of life can come into this center, doesn't matter what religious or ethnic background you are, and partake of the knowledge, but also where scholars were hired to then give lectures on all the non-religious sciences of the day, all the what they call the broader, what are they called, the non-religious sciences? I now forget, but the name, so therefore all the religious knowledge was taught in the mosques, but all the other subjects, so astronomy, engineering, medicine, any subject that was natural sciences, that's the word I was looking for, all the natural sciences in their breadth were taught at this Dar al-Hikmah. And so, we know that Baghdad, of course, played a very major role in terms of transmission of the Greek heritage that the West sees as part of its, patrimony, if you like, or its heritage. Well, Cairo also plays that part. So you have knowledge transmission from Baghdad into Cairo, from Cairo into Cordoba in Andalusia, and then from Cordoba, of course, into the western, cities like Venice and, of course, Cambridge and others, right? That very Paris and others. So Cairo plays a major role in this whole broader transmission of knowledge as well at this time. And so it becomes a major international center. The other thing that happens, Ahmad, at this time is that the Fatimids were, as we said, already economically very well off when they arrive in Egypt. But their arrival in Egypt now gives them access to the Red Sea route. And so they have it dredged out and cleaned up and cleared off all the marauding groups that were there, hijacking, etc. previously. And so they open up this route through the Mediterranean into the Red Sea, into the Indian Ocean. And so they then become part of this very vibrant trade to the Indian Ocean, right across to India, and then to the land route through to China. And we have some very interesting material, particularly from the 11th century, where you hear of this. So, for example, we know that the Fatimids were famous for the rock crystal that they developed, the rock crystal pieces that they developed, and they are still seen as, rare gems the ones that survive. Well, it's not like Egypt. It's not in Egypt that they can mine this rock crystal. Rock crystal is actually mined in Madagascar, and it is brought on ship across the East African coast up to Egypt. And they then have these artisans who are from, present day Syria and Palestine, etc., who then are brought forth, and from Iraq, who then have this artisanship to create these beautiful pieces that they create of rock crystal. We also know that after the Fatimids are politically done and dusted, these pieces retain their value and they get taken into Norman Sicily, and from Sicily into the Western world, into Italy, into Venice, etc., where they are further decorated and they become part of the church reliquaries, which is where the saints' remains are kept in a church. And so they are further embellished with gold and silver, and which is why many of these pieces survive to this day. So you can see the impact that the Fatimids have and the influence that they have and the connectors that they build. So yes, they become a major cultural and, and scientific and major center for artisanship and architecture, etc. So we know that many of the architectural places that the Fatimids build in Cairo, some of these still exist, like the Azhar, like the, as I said, the Al-Hakim Mosque, like the Akbar Mosque, and also many of the city gates that they built. So we still have some of these city gates that survive. And on one of them, for example, to this day, the etching remains, which says, there is another word that I forget, but essentially recognizing Ali as the successor to the Prophet. So you find Aliun Waliullah. That's the phrase. So it's La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, Aliun Waliullah. Right? So you, even to this day, you get some of these, architectural artifacts, and it's very interesting that when the Aga Khan Trust for Culture started doing some work in Cairo to build the Azhar Park, for example, in the last decade, as they were unearthing the soil to actually build the park, because it had been a place where there had been a lot of debris over centuries, they've actually unearthed a part of the Ayyubid wall that was built around Cairo, for during this period as well. So we still keep discovering, in that sense, Fatimid artifacts in that area.
So very economically successful, very scientifically and culturally vibrant. But on the military front, were there more military expansions happening? And what were the relationships that were in place between the Fatimids and the Abbasids, for example, at the time? Were there more
Yeah.
military engagements?
Yeah, yeah. So we do have those, absolutely. And just as I mentioned that the fighting, the military engagements between the Fatimids and the Umayyads of Andalusia, of Spain, happened in some of these North African Maghrebi territories like present-day Algeria and Morocco, and also in the Mediterranean Sea itself as well. Of course, they had several skirmishes or battles which used naval warfare. Similarly, and with the Byzantines as well, of course, because the Byzantine Empire was also very interested in Sicily, in the southern states of Italy, where Fatimids had a strong influence. So again, you have a lot of naval warfare happening there too. When the Fatimids arrive in Egypt, they now need to secure Syria, because that's who they share their border with, right? But Syria was a buffer zone for the Byzantine Empire, because the Byzantine Empire, for them, Aleppo was one of the fronts of their empire. And similarly, the Abbasids were also interested in Syria, of course. So you find that the Fatimids engage in warfare with the Byzantines and with the Abbasids in Syria. A lot of warfare happens there, while the Fatimids are trying to establish their control, particularly in southern and central Syria, which is also where the Abbasids are interested in gaining control. The Byzantine rulers want to ensure that northern Syria remains under their suzerainty, under their control. So there's a lot of fighting that happens in Syria between these three. And in fact, in terms of expansion of territory, Syria remains their Achilles heel, if you like. They control it some of the time. They lose some of the areas some of the time. It constantly remains in flux. And in fighting in Syria, the Fatimids have to introduce a new element into their military forces. So previously, the Fatimids in North Africa relied on the Kutama Berbers and other Berbers as their main infantry force. When they come to Egypt, warfare in Syria requires light cavalry forces, which the Turks had become very good at. So you now have the recruitment of Turks into the Fatimid army and therefore at the Fatimid court. So the Turks come to be called the Easterners, the Masharika, and the Kutama and the other Berbers who had come with the Fatimids from the west, from Ifriqiya and other places in North Africa, come to be called the Maghariba, the Westerners. And as long as the Fatimid rulers are have the reins of political power in their hand, they are able to manage these two factions who are at loggerheads with each other in the Fatimid court and in the empire. But once the Fatimid rulers start to lose political control and the military generals start to take over, which is from the 11th century onwards, then these two factions become a major source of weakness for the Fatimids and are one of the reasons for their eventual downfall.
Can we talk a little bit about that downfall? So what were some of the, internal and external challenges that led to the decline and eventual fall of the Fatimids?
Yeah, yeah. So it's so as I say, the Fatimids arrive in 969. They finally get the dynasty finally gets defeated in 1171. But by 1094, you have one of the major markers of their decline. What happens in 1094 is that you have the Fatimid Imam Caliph al-Mustansir Billah, who is in power. He comes to power when he's appointed when he is as the Imam Caliph when he is only 7 years old. So of course the generals are really in power until Mustansir Billah is of a certain age and able to reclaim some of that authority in the court. It's also the time when Egypt goes through a major famine for 7 years. People are reduced to a third of the population of its original population because they die of hunger and pestilence, etc. So it's a very precarious time for the country. And during all of that, you then have a major succession crisis that takes place. Al-Mustansibila dies. According to the Nizari Ismailis, which is a faction that happens after the death of Mustansibila, Nizar had been appointed by Al-Mustansibila. We have a coin that names Nizar as Wali Ahad, etc. Anyway, so you have his eldest son Nizar, who some sources say was appointed as the successor to Al-Mustansibila. But the person who is actually placed on the throne is Ahmad al-Mustali, who is the youngest son or one of the younger sons of Al-Mustansibila. But he is married to the sister of the general at the time called Al-Afdal. So you have the general then using his leverage to appoint his brother-in-law, who is the younger son of Al-Mustansibila, to power. What that does is it creates a major faction within the Fatimid Shia themselves. So there are those who then follow Nizar, who escapes to Alexandria, gets support there. Eventually, he is defeated there by the forces of Afdal after a year or so. And the Nizari Ismailis then essentially are the vanquished ones in Egypt, but they established themselves in Alamut in Iran, which is in the Caspian region of Iran. And so then you have this whole Nizari exodus with its foundation in Alamut, as it were, as an alternate center of authority now of Nizari Ismailis. But there were Nizari Ismailis who also supported the cause in Syria and in other places. But you have a split. And that split means that there is a major fracture from within the Fatimid house. So internally, that weakens the Fatimids significantly. Externally, there are several things happening as well. We have the Crusaders who have arrived in the region to reclaim Palestine, and Palestine was under, in Jerusalem specifically, and Jerusalem was under Fatimid rule at this time. So, of course, there is all this warfare now with the Crusaders in town, as it were. You also have the Abbasids are now being supported by the Seljuk Turks who have recently come into the region and who see themselves as the caretakers of the Abbasid Caliphate. And so they militarily enabled the Abbasids to become much more powerful than they had been under the Buyids previously. So you have the Seljuk Turks. So you have several shifting now dynamics happening in the region, all of which eventually weakened the Fatimid rule in Egypt. And eventually you have Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, who comes over, initially takes over as a Fatimid vizier, but soon thereafter declares the Fatimid as null and void, and as Abbasid sources then claim that he has reclaimed, Salahuddin has reclaimed Egypt for Sunni Islam, as it were. And so the chapter of Ismaili Shia, or just generally Shia Islam, in terms of political rule in Egypt, is brought to a close.
Interesting. So Salah ad-Din, very well known and famous Kurdish general who reconquered Jerusalem from the
Yes,
Crusaders.
yes,
After his conquest or his recapture of the Holy Land, he
yes,
then goes on to defeat the Fatimids. Well, not defeat. He first became the vizier and then
yes.
uh, overtook them, and kind of that was the end of the Fatimid
Yeah,
dynasty.
yeah.
Interesting. And so, and maybe just to wrap here, what is the legacy of the Fatimid Caliphate in the world, in the Islamic world, and in the broader Middle East, both from a religious, from a political, and from a cultural perspective?
Yeah. So it's very interesting that the branch of the Fatimids that continued in Egypt up until 1171, we have very little record of that continuing any further. I know after a couple of generations it dies out. But these schisms, these scions, that is, as it were, of the Fatimids, the Nizari Ismailis, for example, the Nizar, who then established themselves in Iran, then continue and are around today. So the Nizari Ismailis are the ones who accept His Highness the Aga Khan as their 49th Imam, for example. You also have another schism that happens in Fatimid Egypt, where a group of Ismailis split up from the Egyptian line and established themselves in Yemen originally. And initially they are called the Mustali Ismailis, but then they become the Tayyibi Ismailis. And the Tayyibi branch of the Ismailis also continues today, because they then move over to India Arabia. So those who are called the Dawoodi Ismailis or the Sulaimani Ismailis in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia today. The Dawoodis are mainly in India, but also some in Yemen, etc. The Alawi Bohras, the Bohras whom we know of as well, as that's their other name. All these other branches of Ismaili Shia have continued to this day and therefore look back to the Fatimids as part of their legacy, which is also interesting why a number of projects have happened in terms of renovation of architectural sites in Egypt that the Bohra Ismaili Dais have, overseen and paid for, etc. So you find that the Ismaili Shia story continues, as it were, through these different groups. That's one side of the story. In terms of Egypt itself, of course, for someone like Al-Makrizi, the Mamluk scholar who writes about the Fatimids, he takes great pride in the Fatimids because and he's a 15th century scholar, as I say, it is according to him, and rightly so historically, because the Fatimids claim to be caliphs, and therefore Egypt becomes the seat of the caliphate for the first time up until that time, right? So under the Umayyads, Egypt had been a very lucrative province from which, of course, a large amount of grain was sent to the Hijaz, to Mecca and Medina, and to Damascus. The same system continues under the Abbasids, but under the Fatimids, Egypt becomes the seat of the caliphate. And so that's the first time that happens. And in terms of the reverence for the Ahlul Bayt, for the family of the Prophet, you find that Egypt retains that to this day. So we know that the birth of Imam Hussein, the grandson, the beloved grandson of the Prophet, is celebrated in great style in Egypt. And, hundreds and thousands of Egyptians will come to Cairo to celebrate that day and to pray at the mosque of Hussein, etc. So you find that kind of reverence, to my mind, transcends the Sunni, Shia, Sufi kind of divides that later become so fixed and today, unfortunately, in some quarters, have been the basis for the kind of polarization that you find among Muslims. Because, of course, the family of the Prophet is the family of the Prophet. And for the Sufis as well, whether they are Shia or Sunni or just Sufi generally, love and devotion to the Prophet is seen as a very powerful way, practice of faith. So you find that some of these features, if you like, continue the celebration, as I said, of the Mawlid of the Prophet or of the Mawlid of the Imam Hussein, are palpable cultural expressions, I think, in Egypt that provide for that continuity. Because we know that one of the things that the Fatimids were very famous for was to very lavish public festivities around these occasions. So you can kind of see that has something that has stayed in the Egyptian psyche, as it were.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Shainool. It's been truly amazing speaking to you and learning more about this fascinating period of history. It's been great. Is there anything that we've missed that you'd like to talk about? Do you have any upcoming books or articles or anything that you think our listeners should be looking out for?
So, if people are interested in the Fatimids, then of course there's a lot of material on the Fatimids available now. But if you want an initial introduction into the Fatimids, written with few footnotes and, but written more in a narrative style that is of hopefully of interest and engagement, so for a more non-specialist reader. Then the book that I published, The Fatimids, The Rise of a Muslim Empire, which is available in paperback, which is available, actually I have a copy in case you wanted to, that's the book I'm talking about. And that's available in paperback, it's available in audio, it's available in digital formats. It's also been translated into several languages. So somebody wants to kind of get a first, 101, Fatimids 101, well, that book provides an update into the first 60 years of Fatimid rule, from their origins all the way up to their arrival in Egypt. And there's a part two to it called the Fatimids, the rule from Egypt, which then speaks about their 2-century rule in Egypt, and their decline, etc., and their legacy. Hopefully, if there are any major gaps or even curiosities that this conversation has raised for people, that is, and then of course, there is a list of further readings in that book and reference to several primary sources, etc., that people can then use to follow up on as they wish.
Great. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. And thank you so much again, Professor. It was great
Very
speaking with you
welcome.
today.
Can I just ask, Ahmad, what's the timeline you're looking